I held the American shell casing in my hands, turning it over in the dim light of our makeshift workshop near Bastogne. 76 millimeters. The brass was still warm, extracted from the wreckage of Lieutenant Becker's Panther just hours before. My hands weren't shaking from the cold Belgian winter of 1944, they were shaking because I finally understood what we were truly facing. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The American Sherman tank, we had been told repeatedly, mounted a weak 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate our armor. Yet here in my hands was physical evidence that everything we'd been taught was becoming obsolete. The date was December 18th, 1944. The location was a frozen forest road somewhere in the Ardennes, where Hitler's last great gamble, the operation we would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge, was already beginning to falter. I was an Obergefreiter, a senior lance corporal, serving as gunner and later acting commander in a Panther tank of the 1st SS Panzer Division. My name doesn't matter now. What matters is what I learned during those terrible winter days, and how a simple brass shell casing shattered every assumption I held about German technological superiority. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. We had gone to war believing absolutely in the superiority of German engineering. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was supported by mathematics, by metallurgy, by the hard science of armor penetration and ballistics. Our training at the Panzer schools had been thorough and systematic. We learned the specifications of every Allied tank, memorized their weaknesses, and practiced the tactics that would exploit those vulnerabilities. The American M4 Sherman tank, in particular, had been presented to us as almost pitiable in its inferiority. I remember my instructor at the training facility in Putlos during late 1943, a veteran of the North African campaign named Hauptmann Weber. He stood before a large diagram showing the Sherman's profile, pointing with his wooden stick at various weak points. The American Sherman, he announced with absolute confidence, is armed with a 75mm M3 gun. This weapon has a muzzle velocity of approximately 620 meters per second when firing armor-piercing ammunition. At 1,000 meters range, it can penetrate roughly 70 millimeters of vertical armor plate. He moved his pointer to a diagram of the Panther. Our Panzer IV Panther, which most of you will crew, has frontal armor of 80 millimeters thickness, sloped at 55 degrees. This slope effectively increases the armor's resistance to approximately 140 millimeters equivalent. The Sherman's 75mm gun cannot penetrate our frontal armor at any combat range. It would need to maneuver to our flanks or rear to achieve a kill. The numbers were real. The physics was sound. We believed him because the evidence supported his claims. When we asked about American tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine, which mounted a more powerful 3-inch gun, Hauptmann Weber acknowledged they were more dangerous, but emphasized they were thinly armored and relatively few in number. The standard Sherman, we were assured, would be our primary opponent, and we would dominate it. Our own Panther's main gun, the 75mm KBUK 42 liters, 70, was a different beast entirely. With a much longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity of approximately 925 meters per second, it could penetrate 138 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. Against the Sherman's frontal armor of approximately 64 millimeters, it could achieve kills at ranges where the American tank couldn't effectively return fire. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. This wasn't empty boasting. In the summer of 1944, after the Allied invasion of Normandy, we saw the proof ourselves. My Panther company was deployed to France in July, part of the desperate German effort to contain the Allied breakout. Near the town of Villers-Bocage, we encountered an American armored column moving along a narrow road. The engagement was brutally one-sided. I was serving as a gunner in my company commander's Panther that day. Through my gun sight, I watched as our first shot struck a Sherman at approximately 800 meters range. The armor-piercing round punched completely through the Sherman's frontal armor, and within seconds, smoke was pouring from its hatches. The American tank never had a chance to return effective fire. Over the next 20 minutes, we systematically destroyed 7 Sherman tanks. They attempted to maneuver, to find flanking positions, but the terrain favored us, and our superior range meant we could engage them before they closed to distances where their guns might threaten us. We lost 1 Panther that day, but not to enemy fire. The tank suffered a transmission failure, a chronic problem with the Panther design, and had to be abandoned when American infantry threatened to overrun our position. The crew escaped, and we withdrew after accounting for our victory. 7 confirmed kills against no combat losses. The mathematics of our superiority seemed proven beyond doubt. Throughout the late summer and autumn of 1944, this pattern repeated itself across the Western Front. American tankers were brave, often recklessly so, but bravery couldn't overcome the fundamental disparity in our respective tanks' capabilities. They needed to be close to within 300 or 400 meters to have a reasonable chance of penetrating our armor, and we could destroy them at twice that range or more. The tactical situation forced them into desperate flanking maneuvers, into rushed attacks that left them exposed, into sacrifices that seemed almost suicidal from our perspective. Yet, even then, observant commanders noted troubling details. The Americans never seemed to run out of tanks. For every Sherman we destroyed, 2 more appeared. Our own losses, mostly to mechanical breakdown and Allied air attacks rather than enemy armor, were difficult to replace. New Panthers arrived slowly, often with undertrained crews fresh from abbreviated training programs. The veterans among us began to sense that something was wrong with the strategic picture, even if the tactical engagements continued to favor us. By December of 1944, I had been promoted to acting tank commander after my predecessor was killed by fragments from an Allied bomb. Our Panther battalion was withdrawn from the front lines in late November, supposedly for rest and refit. Instead, we found ourselves preparing for something big. Security was extraordinarily tight. We were forbidden from writing letters home. Our maps showed only local details, with broader geographical context deliberately obscured. On December 15th, we finally learned our objective. Hitler had conceived a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied armies, recapturing the vital port of Antwerp, and forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. The plan was audacious, perhaps desperate, but we were assured of success. The Ardennes sector was lightly held by inexperienced American divisions. The winter weather would ground Allied aircraft. Our Panzer divisions would achieve breakthrough and exploitation before the enemy could react. Our company commander, Hauptmann Dietrich, briefed us on the intelligence regarding enemy forces. The Americans opposite us are garrison troops, new divisions still learning their trade. They have Sherman tanks, yes, but we've fought Shermans before. You know what to do. He paused, looking at each of us in turn. This is Germany's last chance. We break through here, or we lose the war. Every tank, every shot, every meter of advance matters. We believed him. More accurately, we wanted to believe him. By late 1944, even the most fanatical among us could see that Germany was losing. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Allied bombers ranged freely over our cities. But this offensive, we told ourselves, might change everything. And we still had our Panthers, still had our tactical superiority, still had the skill and experience of veteran crews. The offensive began before dawn on December 16, 1944. Our battalion rolled forward through the fog-shrouded Ardennes, our tracks churning the frozen ground. Initial resistance was light. American positions, surprised and overwhelmed, fell back in confusion. We bypassed strong points, drove deep into the enemy rear areas, and maintained momentum. The plan was working. For the first 2 days, Everything proceeded according to our expectations. The American infantry we encountered seemed demoralized, surrendering in large groups when our tanks appeared. The few Sherman tanks we saw were the familiar 75mm variants. We destroyed them with the methodical efficiency we had demonstrated throughout the summer and autumn. Our training, our equipment, our tactics all seemed vindicated. I remember feeling almost optimistic on the morning of December 18th. We had penetrated perhaps 20 or 30 kilometers into American-held territory. Fuel was becoming a concern. We had been promised, captured American supplies but hadn't found the expected dumps, but our immediate tactical situation seemed favorable. The weather remained overcast, grounding Allied aircraft. American resistance, while stiffening, hadn't yet organized into coherent defensive lines. Then everything changed. We were advancing along a narrow forest road, our company of Panthers moving in column with Hauptmann, Dietrich's tank in the lead. My Panther was third in line, behind the command tank and Lieutenant Becker's vehicle. The forest pressed close on both sides, limiting visibility and maneuver. Not ideal tank country, but the roads were the only routes forward through the thick Ardennes woodland. The Americans had learned since Normandy. They weren't meeting us in open tank versus tank duels anymore. They were using terrain, using ambush tactics, forcing us into situations where our advantages diminished. Lieutenant Becker's voice crackled over the radio, urgent and strained. Contact left, Sherman in the tree line, engaging. The transmission dissolved into static. Through my vision port, I saw Becker's Panther lurch violently, smoke already beginning to pour from its engine deck. But the Sherman's round hadn't struck the rear armor, it had punched straight through the side of the tank. My stomach dropped. That shouldn't have been possible. Panther side armor was 80mm thick. The Sherman's standard 75mm gun couldn't penetrate that thickness at combat ranges. Not reliably. I had seen the test results. I had calculated the mathematics myself. Yet Becker's Panther was clearly hit, clearly penetrated, clearly dying. Gunner, traverse left, target in tree line. I shouted into the intercom, taking command instinctively. Our gunner, Schaefer, was already swinging the turret. Through my periscope, I caught a glimpse of the Sherman as it reversed rapidly into deeper forest cover. Even in that brief moment, something registered as wrong. The gun barrel looked different, longer, thicker than the Shermans we'd been fighting. That's not a 75mm gun, Schaefer said, his voice tight with tension. He'd noticed it too. We fired. The Panther's main gun recoiling smoothly. The high-explosive round struck the tree the Sherman had just vacated, sending up a shower of frozen dirt and wood splinters. The American was gone, already, repositioning. This was new. The Shermans we'd fought before often stood their ground, relying on numbers and mutual support. This crew was using shoot-and-scoot tactics, firing and immediately displacing before we could acquire them properly. It suggested better training, different doctrine, or perhaps just the accumulated experience of units that had been fighting us for months. Over the next 20 minutes, our column was hit repeatedly. Not destroyed the Americans, seemed to be deliberately targeting our tracks and running gear, immobilizing Panthers on the narrow road, rather than attempting complete kills. One Sherman would fire from concealment on our left flank, then another would engage from a different position entirely. They were coordinating, using the terrain expertly, refusing to give us the frontal engagements where our superior armor and firepower would dominate. By the time we managed to withdraw, abandoning 4 immobilized Panthers for later recovery, I was drenched and in sweat despite the freezing December temperature. We had been fought to a standstill by what intelligence had told us were inferior tanks with inferior guns crewed by inexperienced soldiers. Something fundamental had changed, and we hadn't been informed. That evening, our recovery vehicles managed to retrieve Lieutenant Becker's Panther. Becker himself was dead, killed instantly by the penetrating shot. His gunner and loader were wounded but alive. We gathered around the damaged tank in the fading winter light, examining the wound in its hull. The hole was clean and round, approximately 76 millimeters in diameter. The American shell had punched completely through the 80mm side armor, crossed the fighting compartment, and exited through the opposite side. There was no mistaking what this meant. The Americans had developed a Sherman variant with a more powerful gun, one capable of defeating Panther side armor at combat ranges. Our company mechanic, Feldwebel, Krause, climbed inside the damaged tank to extract shell fragments for analysis. When he emerged, his face was grim. He held up pieces of the projectile, the base of the shell casing, and fragments of the penetrator core. 76 millimeters, he announced to those of us gathered around. This is a high-velocity armor-piercing round, probably tungsten cord, not their standard 75mm ammunition at all. He handed me the shell casing base. The brass was still warm to the touch, heated by friction during its passage through steel. American markings were stamped into the metal, though I couldn't fully decipher them. But the diameter was unmistakable, 76 millimeters. I stood there in the cold December twilight, turning that piece of brass over in my hands, and felt something shift in my understanding. If the Americans could field a gun that penetrated 80 millimeters of armor, that meant they could potentially threaten even heavier German tanks at certain ranges and angles. The Tiger I, with its 100 millimeters of frontal armor, might be vulnerable at close range. Our doctrine, our tactics, our training, all had been based on assumptions that were no longer valid. How many of these do they have? Someone asked. It was the question we were all thinking about. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Our intelligence services had failed us completely. We had been fighting an enemy whose equipment we no longer fully understood. The comfortable superiority we'd enjoyed for months was suddenly uncertain. Hauptmann Dietrich called an officers' conference that night in a requisitioned Belgian farmhouse. The mood was somber. We'd lost 4 Panthers to immobilization, and Becker's death reminded us all of our vulnerability. When the Hauptmann spoke, his usual confidence seemed strained. Intelligence has confirmed that the Americans have been upgrading their Sherman tanks with a new 76mm gun since summer, he said. We should have been informed earlier, but communication between the front and high command has been difficult. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Nobody missed the implication our intelligence apparatus was failing. The new gun has significantly better armor penetration than the 75mm. It can threaten our side armor and possibly our frontal armor at close range. We must adjust tactics accordingly. No more column movements through restricted terrain. We advance in line when possible, maintain a frontal aspect to enemy positions, and use our range advantage. He continued the briefing, but I was only half listening. My mind was working through the implications. If the Americans had upgraded the Sherman's armament significantly, what else had they improved? What other surprises awaited us? And most troubling of all, how many of these upgraded Shermans were in the field? The next several days provided answers we didn't want. As the offensive ground moved far forward, then stalled, then began to falter, we encountered more and more of these new 76mm Shermans. They weren't everywhere. Many American units still fielded the older 75mm variant, but their numbers were clearly significant and growing. We learned to identify them at a distance by their longer gun barrels, and we adjusted our tactics accordingly. But adjustment had a cost. The cautious maneuvering required to keep our frontal armor toward the enemy slowed our advance. The need to avoid close-range engagements meant passing up opportunities. And always, underlying every tactical decision, was the corrosive awareness that our material superiority was no longer absolute. On December 22nd, we captured an American tank crew after destroying their Sherman in an engagement near Bastogne. The tank had been a 76mm variant, and we were eager to interrogate the crew about their equipment. The tank commander was a young lieutenant, probably no older than 23 or 24. Despite his situation, he seemed more resigned than frightened. Through our interpreter, we questioned him about the new gun. How long had they been fielding it? How many tanks mounted it? What were its capabilities? The lieutenant answered readily enough. Either he didn't consider the information particularly secret, or he was following some doctrine about what to reveal under interrogation. We started getting the 76mm Shermans in our battalion back in August, he said. Not every tank, maybe one platoon per company at first, but more keep arriving. I heard the factories back home are converting the production lines. How many? Our intelligence officer pressed. How many Sherman tanks mount this gun? The American shrugged. I don't know the total numbers, thousands probably. Every month more arrive from the States. The old 75mm tanks get rotated out, sent to training units or other theatres. The 76s come forward. He paused, then added something that would stick with me. You guys keep acting like you're fighting the same army you fought in Normandy. We're not. We're learning, upgrading, getting better equipment. The army we have now is way different than 6 months ago. That conversation haunted me. The young American lieutenant had articulated something we were only beginning to grasp, that we were fighting an enemy capable of systematic improvement at a scale we couldn't match. The 76mm gun wasn't just a weapon upgrade. It was evidence of an industrial and organizational system that could identify deficiencies, develop solutions, and deploy them across entire armies in a matter of months. We interrogated the lieutenant further about American tank production. How many Shermans were being built? Where were the factories? How quickly could they replace losses? He laughed, not unkindly, when we pressed him on production. Numbers. You really don't know, do you? He shook his head. We're building something like 2,000 tanks a month, maybe more now. I'm not sure of the exact figures, but it's a lot. We've got factories all over Detroit, mostly, but other places too. They run 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 2,000 tanks per month. The number seemed absurd. Our entire panzer force on both the eastern and western fronts numbered perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 tanks at any given time, and those included older Panzer IVs, captured vehicles, and tanks undergoing repair. The Americans, if this prisoner was telling the truth, could replace our entire armoured strength every 3 months. But was he telling the truth? Prisoners sometimes exaggerated their own side's strength, either from genuine ignorance or deliberate deception. Yet something in the lieutenant's casual delivery suggested he believed what he was saying. This wasn't boasting, it was simply stating facts he considered common knowledge. After the interrogation, I discussed it with Feldwebel Kraus, our mechanic. He was older than most of us, a veteran of the First World War who had worked in German industry between the wars. Is it possible? I asked him. Could the Americans really be producing tanks at that rate? Kraus was silent for a moment, thinking. The Americans have the capacity, he finally said. Their automobile industry before the war was enormous, far larger than ours. Ford alone was producing more cars annually than our entire German automotive sector. If they've converted those production lines to military equipment, he trailed off. But the implication was clear. But that would mean they have more tanks than we could ever hope to destroy, I said, voicing the thought we were all avoiding. Yes, Kraus agreed quietly. It would mean exactly that. The Ardennes offensive continued, but the momentum had clearly shifted. By Christmas of 1944, the weather cleared, and American aircraft appeared in force. Fighter bombers hunted our columns relentlessly. Supply lines stretched thin, fuel became critically scarce, and on the ground, American resistance stiffened as reinforcements poured in. We continued to encounter the 76mm Shermans with increasing frequency. Each engagement forced us to be more cautious, more methodical, more conservative with our increasingly limited resources. The easy victories of the first days became grinding, costly battles of attrition. On December 27th, my own Panther was hit for the first time in combat. We had been duelling with what we thought were 3 Shermans, positioned on a ridgeline overlooking a small Belgian village. In reality, there were 5 American tanks, 2 hidden in defilade positions, waiting for us to commit to the attack. The 76mm round struck our turret side at an oblique angle. It didn't fully penetrate the armor, but the impact caused massive, spalling fragments of steel, breaking off the interior surface and ricocheting through the fighting compartment like shrapnel. Schaefer, my gunner, took multiple fragments in his shoulder and arm. Our loader was hit in the leg. Only my position in the commander's cupola saved me from injury. I ordered the crew to bail out. Within seconds, we were abandoning our Panther and retreating on foot through the frozen forest. Behind us, secondary explosions began to cook off our ammunition as fire spread through the tank. The Panther, that had been my home for months, that had protected us through dozens of engagements, was burning. We reached German lines after a terrifying 2-hour march through snow and forest, expecting American infantry to appear at any moment. By the time we were debriefed and assigned to a replacement Panther, I had lost all illusions about German invincibility. The tactical superiority we'd enjoyed was eroding, and the strategic situation was becoming dire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In early January of 1945, our battalion was pulled back from the line. We had started the offensive with 17 operational Panthers. We now had 4. The losses were staggering: 13 tanks in less than 3 weeks. Some had been destroyed by enemy fire. More had been abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Several had been knocked out by American aircraft. But increasingly, the 76mm Shermans were accounting for our casualties. During the withdrawal, I had the opportunity to examine another destroyed Panther more closely. This one had been hit multiple times by 76mm rounds. 3 penetrations were visible on the side armor. The tank's interior was a charnel house, and I won't describe what we found there. What struck me, though, was the systematic nature of the damage. The American gunners hadn't just gotten lucky, they had engaged this Panther at close range and methodically destroyed it with multiple hits. I retrieved another 76mm shell casing from the wreckage, this one lodged in the damaged road wheel assembly. It joined the first casing I'd collected from Becker's tank. I kept both, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. Perhaps they were talismans, physical reminders of a truth I was struggling to accept. By late January, the Ardennes offensive had completely failed. We had been pushed back to our starting positions, having achieved nothing except the loss of men and materiel we couldn't replace. The Western Allies were preparing to resume their advance into Germany itself, and I was sitting in a cold barracks room, turning brass shell casings over in my hands, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. The 76mm gun itself wasn't the problem, not really. Yes, it was more dangerous than the 75mm, but our Panthers could still defeat Shermans in most tactical situations if properly employed. The real problem, the one that slowly crystallized in my understanding, was what that gun represented. The Americans had identified a deficiency in their tank armament sometime in 1943 or early 1944. They had designed a new gun, tested it, put it into production, and deployed it to combat units, all in less than a year. And they had done this while continuing to produce thousands of tanks, while supplying their allies, while fighting in multiple theatres simultaneously. Germany, by contrast, had spent years developing and refining the Panther. When problems emerged, and they did, many of them we struggled to implement fixes. Our production numbers remained relatively modest. Our supply lines were increasingly disrupted by Allied bombing. Our training programs were shortened due to manpower shortages and fuel scarcity. The Americans were improving faster than we could destroy them. It was that simple and that devastating. In February of 1945, our unit was reorganized and sent east to face the Soviet advance. We received 2 replacement Panthers to bring our company up to a total of 6 operational tanks, barely a third of our authorized strength. The crews were increasingly composed of young men with minimal training, boys really, pulled from the Luftwaffe or the Hitler Youth and given abbreviated instruction before being thrust into combat. Before we departed for the Eastern Front, I had a conversation with Hauptmann Dietrich that illuminated how thoroughly our leadership had miscalculated. We were alone in his office, finalizing the movement orders, when he suddenly set down his papers and looked at me. "Obergefreiter," he said quietly, "what did you think of that American prisoner we interrogated, the one who claimed they were producing 2,000 tanks per month?" "I think he was telling the truth, Herr Hauptmann," I replied. Dietrich nodded slowly. "I obtained some additional intelligence reports, captured documents, primarily. The American claim appears to be accurate, perhaps even conservative." He paused. "We've been receiving reports of American tank production since 1943. The numbers have been available to High Command. They simply chose not to believe them." He pulled out a folder and showed me a document. I couldn't read it in detail, but I saw the numbers. American tank production for 1944, approximately 17,500 units. German production for the same period, approximately 9,000 armoured vehicles of all types, including tank destroyers and self-propelled guns. "The Americans outproduced us nearly 2-1, Dietrich said. "And that's just tanks. Aircraft production is even more lopsided. They built over 96,000 aircraft last year. We managed perhaps 36,000, and most of those were fighters desperately trying to defend our airspace rather than bombers or ground attack aircraft to support our armies." He closed the folder. "The 76mm gun you've been concerned about, it's a symptom, not a disease. The disease is that we went to war against an industrial power that can outproduce us by factors we can't overcome through tactical superiority or better training or more advanced technology. Then why are we still fighting?" I asked. It was perhaps insubordinate, but Dietrich and I had been through too much together for strict formality. "Because the alternative is surrender," he said simply, "and because there are men in Berlin who still believe in final victory, or at least in negotiating a conditional peace. They're wrong, of course, but we're soldiers. We follow orders." The conversation ended there, but it stayed with me. Dietrich had articulated what I had been slowly realizing, that the war was already lost, had perhaps been lost from the moment America entered the conflict and fully mobilized its industrial capacity. All our tactical victories, all our superior weapons, all our tactical skill, none of it mattered against an enemy who could replace losses faster than we could inflict them. The Eastern Front was worse than the West in every conceivable way. The Soviets had their own mass of tanks, their own artillery, their own industrial capacity. They had learned from their defeats in 1941 and 42, adapting and improving just as the Americans had. And they were motivated by a rage that came from having their homeland invaded and devastated. My war ended on March 12, 1945, near the Remagen bridgehead. We had been sent to help contain the American breakout across the Rhine. By then, fuel shortages were so severe that we often couldn't move our tanks at all. We would find defensive positions and simply wait for the inevitable American advance, knowing we lacked the fuel to withdraw even if ordered. When American infantry overran our position, we had barely enough fuel in our Panthers tanks to run the engine for perhaps 30 minutes. There was no possibility of escape or maneuver. We surrendered rather than see our crew die in a pointless last stand. Some of the younger soldiers wanted to resist, to die fighting, but Hauptmann Dietrich, who was with our position when it was overrun, ordered us to surrender. "The war is over," he said. "Don't throw away your lives for nothing." The journey to the prisoner of war camp took 2 days. We were loaded into American trucks, dozens of them in a long convoy, and transported west toward France. During those 2 days, I saw more of the American rear areas than I had ever imagined, and what I saw completed the psychological transformation that had begun with that first 76mm shell casing. The American logistics network was beyond anything I had conceived possible. The roads were choked with traffic, but it was organized traffic. Military police directed vehicles at intersections. Supply convoys moved with clockwork efficiency, and maintenance units serviced vehicles in enormous motor pools that stretched for kilometers. I tried counting trucks at one point, but gave up after reaching 200. They just kept coming, an endless stream of vehicles carrying ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies, everything an army needed to sustain itself. We passed through a supply depot that covered several square kilometers. Mountains of crates and containers stood in organized rows. Fuel bladders the size of houses fed pumping stations. And tanks, dear God, the tanks. Shermans fresh from American factories sat in neat rows, awaiting assignment to combat units. I tried to count them but lost track after 150. An entire Panzer division's worth of tanks, just sitting there waiting to be distributed. A young American guard noticed me staring. He followed my gaze and smiled. Impressive, huh? That's just one day's delivery to this depot. Tomorrow another train will arrive with more. There's a dozen depots like this between here and the coast. How many tanks? I asked in broken English, needing to know. He shrugged casually. Thanks? At this depot specifically? Maybe 50 or 60 pass through daily? Could be more. I don't keep an exact count. He seemed amused by my reaction. You Germans never had a chance, you know. We're just too big, too rich, too productive. You can't fight an assembly line. He was right, of course. That was the most galling part. He was absolutely right, and he knew it, and he could afford to be generous about it because the outcome had never been in doubt. Not really. Not once American industry fully mobilized. The prisoner of war camp in eastern France, where I spent the next several months, housed approximately 5,000 German soldiers. Among them were other Panzer crewmen from various units, and we spent long hours discussing what had gone wrong. Many still clung to beliefs about German technical superiority, about how our individual weapons were better even if we lost the overall war. They were missing the point entirely, and I found myself trying to explain what I had learned. Yes, the Panther was a better tank than the Sherman in many ways, I would say. Thicker armor, more powerful gun, better optics. But the Americans had 50 Shermans for every Panther we could field. And when our 75mm gun wasn't good enough, they developed the 76mm and put it into mass production in less than a year. They could adapt and improve faster than we could destroy them. Some understood. Others refused to accept it, preferring to believe that we had lost due to betrayal or bad luck or overwhelming numbers alone. They couldn't grasp that the numbers themselves were the decisive factor, that modern industrial warfare was fundamentally about production capacity and logistics rather than individual weapon quality. An older prisoner, a Wehrmacht major named Hoffmann, who had served in North Africa before being transferred to the Western Front, finally articulated what I had been struggling to express. We were sitting in the barracks one evening in May, after Germany's surrender, discussing the war's outcome. We designed weapons to win battles, Hoffmann said quietly. The Americans designed weapons to win wars. There's a fundamental difference in philosophy, he explained further. The Panther was optimized for tactical superiority. It could win the individual tank engagement, but the Sherman was optimized for strategic victory. It was good enough in performance, could be mass-produced, was mechanically reliable enough for rapid deployment, and was simple enough that minimally trained crews could operate it effectively. The Americans didn't need the best tank. They needed a tank they could build thousands of, maintain in the field, and crew with soldiers trained in months rather than years. He paused, then added, and when the 75mm gun proved inadequate, they didn't spend years developing a perfect replacement. They developed a good enough replacement and got it into production immediately. That's the difference. We pursued perfection. They pursued adequacy at an overwhelming scale. It was the clearest explanation I had heard, and it resonated because it matched everything I had observed. The 76mm gun wasn't perfect. Later, I learned that American tank crews actually preferred an even more powerful gun, the 90mm mounted on the M26 Pershing heavy tank that appeared in small numbers near the war's end. But the 76mm was good enough to reduce the Panther's advantage significantly, and it could be produced quickly and in quantity. Good enough, in overwhelming numbers, backed by logistics that never failed. That was the American way of war, and it had defeated us. In late May of 1945, an American intelligence officer interviewed me about German tank development and tactics. He was professional and courteous, taking detailed notes as I described the Panther's capabilities, our training methods, our tactical doctrines. When I finished, he showed me several photographs that fundamentally changed my understanding of the industrial disparity we had faced. The first photograph showed the interior of an American tank factory, the Ford River Rouge plant, he explained. The production line stretched into the distance, with dozens of Sherman tanks in various stages of assembly. Workers, many of them women, operated heavy machinery and overhead cranes with practiced efficiency. The scale was staggering. At peak production, the officer said, this facility could complete one Sherman tank every 60 minutes. Chrysler's plant in Detroit could match that. We had 8 major tank production facilities operating simultaneously. He showed me another photograph. This is the Watervliet Arsenal in New York. Gun production. The 76mm guns you encountered were designed in late 1943, tested in early 1944, and in mass production by summer of 1944, from concept to battlefield deployment in less than a year. Less than a year. The Germans had spent years developing the Panther, and it still entered service with serious mechanical problems that took additional months to resolve. The Americans had identified a deficiency, designed a solution, and deployed it across entire armies in the time it took us to work the bugs out of our existing weapons. The 76mm wasn't even our best option, the officer continued. We had the 90mm gun on the Pershing by late 1944. That weapon could penetrate your Tiger frontally, but we didn't need it urgently. The 76mm was good enough for most situations, and we could produce more of them faster. Good enough. That phrase again. It was the epitome of American military-industrial philosophy, and it had proven devastatingly effective. He showed me production statistics from an official U.S. Army document. In 1944 alone, American factories had produced approximately 17,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany, by comparison, had produced roughly 9,000 armored vehicles of all types, and that was with our factories working around the clock, using slave labor from concentration camps, under constant threat of Allied bombing. But tanks were only part of the story. Aircraft production showed an even more dramatic disparity. America had built over 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Germany had produced approximately 36,000, most of them fighters desperately trying to defend our airspace rather than bombers or ground attack aircraft to support our armies, and trucks, the unglamorous but essential vehicles that kept armies supplied and mobile, revealed perhaps the most decisive gap. The Americans had produced nearly 700,000 military trucks in 1944. Germany had manufactured perhaps 60,000, many of them converted civilian vehicles or captured equipment. The officer watched me process these numbers, saw the impact they were having. "You fought well," he said, and there was no condescension in his voice. "Your tactics were often superior. Your tank crews were generally better trained. The Panther was, in many ways, a better tank than the Sherman. But you were fighting an industrial system that could outproduce you 10-1 in some categories, while simultaneously fighting Japan in the Pacific, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and maintaining a substantial civilian economy." He closed his folder of photographs and statistics. "Your leadership knew these numbers. They had intelligence reports detailing American production capacity. They simply chose not to believe them, or believed that other factors, tactical superiority, better training, willpower, could overcome the industrial disparity. They were wrong. I was repatriated to Germany in late 1946, returning to a country I barely recognized. The cities were rubble, the economy was shattered. Millions were dead or missing. Everything we had fought for, every sacrifice we had made, had been for nothing. Germany was occupied, divided, defeated utterly and completely. In the years since, I have had much time to reflect on my experiences as a Panzer crewman, and particularly on that December day in the Ardennes when I first held a 76mm shell casing and began to understand the true nature of the war we had been fighting. We were taught to believe in technological superiority, in the excellence of German engineering, in the quality of our weapons and training, and in many individual metrics, we were superior. The Panther could defeat the Sherman in most one-on-one encounters. Our crews were better trained on average. Our tactical doctrine was sophisticated. But none of that mattered because we had fundamentally misunderstood modern industrial warfare. Wars are not won by superior weapons alone. They are won by industrial capacity, by logistics, by the ability to sustain operations over months and years, by replacing losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. The 76mm Sherman represented something far more significant than just an improved tank gun. It represented an entire industrial and philosophical system that we had failed to comprehend until too late. The Americans didn't need perfect weapons. They needed good enough weapons in overwhelming quantities, backed by production capacity we couldn't match, logistics we couldn't interdict, and resources we couldn't deplete. When the Sherman's 75mm gun proved inadequate, they didn't spend years developing a perfect replacement. They developed a good enough improvement and deployed it rapidly while maintaining their production advantage. When crews needed better training, they standardized instruction and expanded training facilities. When maintenance became an issue, they simplified designs and improved field service procedures. They were iterating, learning, adapting, and doing it all at industrial scale. We were still pursuing individual perfection, while they were achieving collective adequacy in numbers that overwhelmed us. The irony that haunts me is this: we were so proud of our technical superiority that we blinded ourselves to strategic reality. Every intelligence report that emphasized Panther superiority over the Sherman was tactically accurate but strategically meaningless. Yes, one Panther could defeat 5 Shermans in ideal conditions, but the Americans could field 50 Shermans, and our conditions were never ideal. By late 1944, they were fielding improved Shermans with the 76mm gun tanks that narrowed the performance gap while maintaining all the advantages of American mass production. Good enough performance, produced in overwhelming numbers, supported by logistics we couldn't match. That was the formula for victory in industrial warfare. The Tiger II tank, which entered production in late 1944, exemplified our flawed approach. It was heavier than the Panther, more powerfully armed, more thickly armored, and far more complex to produce. Germany manufactured approximately 492 Tiger IIs during the entire war. In the same time period, American factories produced tens of thousands of Shermans. We were still thinking in terms of individual tactical superiority while the Americans were fighting a war of industrial attrition. I think about this often now, decades removed from the war. I think about the young soldier I was, so confident in German superiority, holding that first 76mm shell casing and feeling my worldview begin to crack. I think about all the intelligence reports we dismissed, all the warnings about American production capacity we ignored, all the ways we deluded ourselves into believing that quality could overcome quantity. The Americans proved us wrong. Not because they built better individual tanks in many ways, they didn't, but because they built adequate tanks in numbers we couldn't match, supported them with logistics we couldn't disrupt, and improved them faster than we could adapt. They proved that in modern industrial warfare, good enough in overwhelming quantities defeats superior in limited numbers, every single time. That 76mm shell casing I carried through the Ardennes, through my capture, through the POW camp, and eventually back to Germany. I kept it for many years. It sat on my desk as a reminder of a hard lesson learned too late. Eventually, I gave it to a local museum, where perhaps it teaches others what it taught me. Modern war is not won by the army with the best weapons. It is won by the nation with the factories, the resources, the logistics, and the industrial capacity to sustain operations while continuously improving. The Americans understood this from the beginning. We learned it far too late and at terrible cost. The 76mm gun wasn't just an improvement to the Sherman tank. It was evidence of a production and innovation system that could identify problems, develop solutions, and deploy them across entire armies while maintaining overwhelming numerical superiority. It was proof that we were fighting an opponent who combined technical competence with industrial scale beyond anything we could match. We went to war believing our superior weapons would ensure victory. We learned, in forests and fields across Europe, that superiority in individual weapons means nothing when facing an enemy who can field adequate weapons in limitless numbers, backed by an industrial base we couldn't bomb effectively, and supplied by resources we couldn't blockade. That's the truth written in brass and steel, in a 76mm shell casing pulled from a destroyed Panther in the winter of 1944. A truth that cost Germany everything to learn. In industrial warfare, adequate weapons produced in vast quantities by a mobilized economy will always defeat superior weapons produced in limited numbers by an overstretched nation. We learned this too late. I learned it holding warm brass in my frozen hands, finally understanding that our Tiger armor, our Panther guns, our tactical excellence, none of it was ever going to be enough. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.